Rain. Relentless, unforgiving rain. It lashed down on New York City, turning the grimy streets into oily rivers. The neon lights of Times Square reflected in the slick asphalt, a kaleidoscope of broken promises. The air hung heavy, thick with the smell of exhaust fumes and despair. It was the kind of night that crawled under your skin and chilled you from the inside out.
He hated nights like this, nights that mirrored the darkness twisting in his gut.
Detective Alex Carter pulled his trench coat tighter, a futile attempt to keep the dampness at bay. His shoes splashed through puddles, the rhythm a somber beat to the symphony of the city that never sleeps. He was headed toward a scene that promised to be as grim as the weather. A city used to blood, about to bleed again. The flashing lights of a crime scene cut through the gloom a few blocks away. The strobing red and blue painted the rain a grotesque shade of purple. It was a beacon, drawing him in like a moth to a flame. He knew this dance, the grim waltz of death and duty. Tonight, the music was particularly somber. He could feel it in his bones. The body lay sprawled on the wet pavement, a stark silhouette against the flickering neon sign of a closed-down diner. Vincent Russo. Even in death, his name carried weight, a whispered threat in the city's underbelly. His eyes stared up at the unforgiving rain, vacant and accusing. The life drained out of him, leaving behind a shell that was once a king. Carter crouched beside the body, his gaze clinical. 2 bullet holes marred Russo's chest, neat and professional. The work of someone who knew their trade, someone who wanted Russo silenced, permanently. No struggle, no hesitation, just cold, calculated execution.
Anything? Detective Miller, his partner, met his gaze. Miller was a young, eager kid, still wet behind the ears. He hadn't seen enough death to lose his optimism. Not yet.
Double tap to the chest, Carter said, his voice flat. Clean, professional.
Miller frowned, his gaze lingering on the body. Who would want Russo dead? The guy practically owned this city.
Carter didn't answer. He already knew the answer. Russo had been a powerful man, his fingers in every dirty pie the city had to offer. Enemies? He had more than he could count. But this kill, this was personal. Vincent Russo. The name alone was enough to send shivers down the spines of even the most hardened criminals. He was a phantom, a boogeyman whispered about in hushed tones. Russo was the head of one of the most powerful crime families in New York City, his empire built on blood and fear. Drugs, extortion, murder, his reach knew no bounds. Carter had been chasing Russo's shadow for years, always one step behind. The man was a ghost, slippery and untouchable. He was a master manipulator, his web of corruption extending into the highest echelons of power. Judges, politicians, cops, they were all puppets dancing to Russo's tune. But Russo was smart. He never left a trace, his hands clean, his sins washed away by a steady stream of dirty money and loyal soldiers. He was a king, ruling his concrete jungle with an iron fist and a cold heart. And tonight, that reign had come to an end. The question wasn't who wanted Russo dead, it was who finally had the guts to do it, and what it meant for the city he left behind. Carter stared at Russo's lifeless face, a strange mix of emotions swirling within him. He'd spent years trying to put Russo away, years chasing shadows and chasing ghosts. He'd seen the devastation Russo had wrought, the lives shattered, the families torn apart. He'd felt the frustration of justice delayed, of laws seemingly powerless against the might of Russo's empire. There was a part of him, a dark and vengeful part, that felt a sense of grim satisfaction. Russo was gone. The city could finally breathe again. But that satisfaction was quickly overshadowed by a cold dread. This wasn't justice. This was an execution, a brutal display of power that shifted the balance of the city's underworld. And then there was the guilt, the gnawing feeling that he could have done more, that he should have brought Russo down years ago. Could he have saved lives? Could he have prevented this? The thought was a bitter pill to swallow. Russo was gone, but the game wasn't over. It was just beginning. News of Russo's death spread through the city like wildfire. The streets, normally buzzing with life, took on an uneasy quiet. The usual cacophony of car horns and street vendors was replaced by hushed whispers and furtive glances. Fear, like a virus, infected the very air they breathed.
The power vacuum left by Russo's demise was palpable. Rival gangs and ambitious lieutenants would be vying for control, eager to claim their piece of the empire. The city was a powder keg, and it was only a matter of time before it exploded.
Carter could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. He knew this city, knew its rhythm, and right now, that rhythm was offbeat, a discordant symphony on the verge of chaos. He'd seen it before, the way violence begets violence, a vicious cycle fueled by greed and desperation. He had a bad feeling about this, a feeling that Russo's death was just the tip of the iceberg. The funeral was a grand affair, a spectacle of grief and power, held in a cathedral that seemed to weep under the weight of its own opulence. Black limousines lined the street, disgorging a steady stream of mourners dressed in designer suits and dark sunglasses. They were the city's elite, the movers and shakers, the ones who benefited from Russo's reign. And then there was Eleanor Russo.
She stood by her husband's grave, a vision in black. Her face, hidden behind a veil, was a mask of grief. But I noticed the way her eyes darted around, taking in every detail, every whispered conversation. There was a sharpness to her, a calculating intelligence that belied her delicate features. I'd seen that look before, the look of a predator assessing its prey.
Russo might be gone, but something told Carter that Eleanor Russo wasn't about to let her husband's empire crumble. She was a player in this game. He could feel it, and he had a sinking feeling that she was about to make her move. The tip came from an informant, a low-level thug with a gambling debt and a loose tongue, a name, a place, enough to send Carter racing through the city, his sirens a mournful wail in the dead of night. The warehouse loomed before him, a hulking silhouette against the moonless sky. It stood on the edge of the city, forgotten and abandoned, a testament to a bygone era. The air hung heavy with the stench of salt and decay, the perfect place for a clandestine meeting, or an execution.
Carter and Miller approached cautiously, their guns drawn. The only sound was the creak of rusted metal and the distant lapping of waves against the pier.
Inside, shadows danced in the dim light filtering through grimy windows. Carter felt a chill run down his spine. He knew with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic that he was about to walk into the heart of the beast. The warehouse was empty, save for a single figure standing in the center of the vast space, Eleanor Russo. She turned as Carter and Miller entered, her face illuminated by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. She looked different without the veil, harder, colder.
Detective Carter, I was expecting you.
Eleanor, you mind telling me why we're here?
Vincent wasn't the saint everyone thought he was, Detective. He had enemies, dangerous ones.
And you think one of them killed him?
I know they did, and I know who hired them.
Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Carter felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He had a bad feeling he already knew the answer.
It was you, wasn't it?
Carter's voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed in the silence of the warehouse. Eleanor didn't deny it. She simply met his gaze, her eyes filled with a chilling mix of grief and determination.
He was going to get us all killed. He was in too deep, Detective. He lost his way. I did what I had to do.
Carter stared at her, his finger tightening on the trigger. He had her dead to rights, open and shut case. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something that gave him pause. He saw a woman backed into a corner, a woman who had lost everything and was fighting to protect what little she had left.
He lowered his gun, his gut twisting with the weight of his decision. He knew what he had to do. He knew what justice demanded. But he also knew that sometimes justice wasn't black and white. Sometimes it was painted in shades of gray.
The sirens grew louder as police cars converged on the warehouse. Carter turned away from Eleanor, the echo of her words ringing in his ears. He had closed one case, but the questions lingered. Had he chosen the right path? Or had he just allowed another criminal to walk free? In the end, justice was a fickle mistress, and tonight she wore a veil of shadows.